Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2026/273 please raise their hand. Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 11 votes in favor, 2 votes against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
No one should tolerate that they are holding the global economy at gunpoint, but today, Russia and China did tolerate. They sided with a regime that seeks to intimidate the Gulf into submission, even as it brutalizes its own people during a national internet blackout for daring to imagine dignity or freedom. Now it seeks to punish the world as cynical leverage in its death to America approach to foreign policy. We have long known that these countries are capable of paralyzing the Council through obstruction and manufactured confusion.
What if the most important thing that happened in the Middle East this week was not a missile strike, not a naval warning, and not even a diplomatic meeting? What if it was a veto? Because that is what may have happened. China's move on Hormuz was not just another Security Council disagreement. It was a signal. A signal that Washington can no longer assume it alone gets to define what security means in the world's most important energy choke point. And when that assumption starts to crack, the consequences do not stay in the Gulf. They move into oil prices. They move into shipping costs. They move into diesel. They move into inflation. They move into the daily lives of ordinary people far from the Middle East. Now, let's slow this down and make it clear. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway. It is one of the most important trade arteries on Earth. Around 20% of the world's oil and LNG normally flows through it. That means any serious disruption there is immediately global. It is not regional. It is not local. It is global by design. So when the United States and its partners pushed for a Security Council framework around Hormuz, they were not just talking about ships. They were talking about the right to define the rules of maritime order. And that is exactly where China stepped in. China and Russia vetoed the resolution. Beijing argued that the text was unbalanced and could worsen the crisis rather than solve it. That matters because the veto did not just stop a piece of UN paperwork. It denied Washington something more valuable: legitimacy cover. That is the part many people miss. Power does not work only through fleets and missiles. Power also works through language, through mandates, through coalitions, through legal framing, through the ability to make your preferred model of enforcement look like common sense. And this time, China said no. Now, some people will hear that and say, fine, but what does that actually change? It changes a lot. Because the old assumption was this: when a crisis erupted in Hormuz, Washington would define the problem, gather the coalition, patrol the water, and present US-led enforcement as the natural answer. That old assumption is now under visible strain. For decades, the United States enjoyed something close to a monopoly over how Middle East maritime security was discussed and organized. Not total control, but uncontested centrality. This moment tells you that centrality is no longer guaranteed, and the market understood that immediately. Oil prices moved because traders were not just reading diplomatic language. They were reading uncertainty. Reuters reports that doubts around U.S.-Iran diplomacy and Hormuz disruption pushed oil prices higher, with analysts pointing directly to the risk of tighter supplies. That matters because price is where geopolitics becomes personal. People do not experience the Security Council directly. They experience fuel costs. They experience transport inflation. They experience higher food prices. They experience delayed shipments. They experience the cost of global order in their own wallets. So this is not just a geopolitical story. It is a trade story. It is an energy story. It is a cost of living story. And underneath all of that, it is a power story. Now let's talk about what China is actually doing here. China is not trying to replace the US ship for ship in the Gulf, at least not in the simple way some commentators imagine. What China is doing is more strategic. It is using diplomatic weight to prevent Washington from locking in a cleaner international mandate for US-aligned enforcement in Hormuz. That is a very different kind of challenge. It says you may still have ships, you may still have bases, you may still have alliances, but you no longer get automatic agreement that your definition of security is the global definition of security. That is a major shift. And what makes this even more important is that events at sea have also shown the limits of American control. Reuters reported that even under blockade conditions and sanctions pressure, some vessels still entered the Gulf. That does not mean US power vanished. It means enforcement is no longer automatic, clean, or uncontested. And that is exactly what makes the moment strategic. When the law is contested, when enforcement is incomplete, and when markets no longer assume quick stabilization, that is not normal dominance. That is a contested order. And that phrase, contested order, is the real key to this entire story. Because what China did at the UN was not only to block a resolution, it helped reveal that the old US-managed model of maritime security now has rivals strong enough to deny it legitimacy in public. That matters for Washington because this is about more than Hormuz. It is about precedent. If China can push back successfully here, then the issue is not just one strait. It is every future crisis in which the US wants to translate its security preferences into global maritime rules. That includes the Red Sea, the South China Sea, sanctions enforcement, escort coalitions, and the broader struggle over who gets to define freedom of navigation. Now, let's bring this back to our real concern. Why should anyone outside the Gulf care? Because energy choke points are where military power becomes economic pain. If Hormuz is unstable, shipping becomes riskier. If shipping becomes riskier, insurance rises. If insurance rises, freight rises. If freight rises, inflation spreads. If inflation spreads, governments feel it. And when governments feel it, domestic politics shifts. This is why viewers were right to connect this to diesel, living costs, and the everyday economy. They understood something that elite commentary often hides, which is distant conflict becomes local suffering through trade routes. Now, why did China care enough to use a veto here? Because China's interests are material, not symbolic. China needs stable energy flows. China has major exposure to Middle Eastern imports. China does not want the US deciding, alone, what maritime disruption is legitimate, what blockade logic is acceptable, and what shipping risks the rest of the world must absorb. And beyond energy, China is making a broader move. It is saying to the world, Washington's security model is not the only model. American coercive frameworks are not the only frameworks, and multilateral legitimacy cannot be assumed by one power simply because that power still has the biggest navy. That is why this veto shook Washington. Not because it destroyed US power. It didn't. But because it interrupted something almost as important, the assumption that US power naturally translates into accepted global order. That assumption is weakening. And that is exactly why this is a global South story too. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America are watching the same lesson unfold. They are seeing that the US can still threaten, still sanction, still patrol, still pressure. But they are also seeing that Washington no longer has uncontested narrative control over the rules. And once that realization spreads, more states start hedging. They build alternative payments, alternative energy arrangements, alternative shipping partnerships, alternative insurance networks, alternative diplomatic language. That does not happen in one dramatic break. It happens slowly, unevenly, cautiously. But that is how order changes. Not always with war, sometimes with a veto, sometimes with shipping data, sometimes with rising oil prices, sometimes with the realization that the monopoly is no longer a monopoly. Now, to be fair, critics will say China blocked action without offering a clear alternative. That criticism is not meaningless, but it misses the strategic reality. Sometimes in geopolitics, denying your rival a cleaner legal political framework is itself the move. If the blocked resolution would have expanded room for US-aligned escort and enforcement operations, then preventing that outcome is not passive. It is active strategic denial. And that is what happened here. China did not solve the Hormuz crisis, but it did stop Washington from solving it on terms that reinforced US dominance. That distinction matters. Now here is the deeper liberation lens takeaway. This is not only a story about China getting stronger, it is a story about US monopoly power becoming less automatic. And once a monopoly over maritime security starts to weaken, the implications go far beyond the Gulf. Because maritime order is not just about ships. It is about trade. It is about sanctions, odds. It is about finance. It is about insurance. It is about energy. It is about who gets to decide what counts as a threat, what counts as protection, and what cost the rest of the world is expected to carry. That is why this moment matters. And that is why Washington felt the veto as more than a diplomatic setback. It felt it as a warning. The world is changing. The US still has enormous power, but it no longer has the final word by default. So what should viewers watch next? First, watch whether Washington now tries to build parallel coalitions outside the UN framework. If it cannot get the Security Council language it wants, it will likely try to build political legitimacy elsewhere. Second, watch how China continues to frame Hormuz. If Beijing keeps presenting this as a global trade issue, instead of a narrow Iran issue that widens its diplomatic appeal. Third, watch the ships. Watch tanker movements, insurance reactions, and rerouting patterns. Ships tell the truth faster than speeches. Fourth, watch prices. Watch oil, diesel, freight, and electricity. That is where ordinary people will feel whether this remains a temporary scare or becomes a structural shift. And finally, watch the language of other states. If more countries begin adopting China's framing, root causes, restraint, balance, no unilateral maritime order, then the old US vocabulary is losing its monopoly too. So let's end clearly. This was not just a Chinese veto. It was a challenge to an old habit of power. Washington wanted Hormuz treated as a security emergency that naturally justified its preferred model of order. China interrupted that. Markets reacted. Ships kept testing the boundaries. Prices rose. And the world got a glimpse of something bigger than one diplomatic clash. The age of uncontested US management of Middle East maritime security is under pressure. And when that pressure hits a choke point as vital as Hormuz, the consequences do not stay on a map. They reach your costs. They reach your politics. They reach your future. Because in the end, the veto did not just stop a resolution. It exposed a transition. And the question now is no longer whether Washington is powerful. The question is whether Washington still gets to define the rules of the game alone. This is Liberation Lens. We report the news, then we expose the structure underneath it.